Picture this. You are standing in the ruins of Samarkand, March 1220. The air is heavy with smoke, not the clean wood smoke of a hearth, but the acrid residue of charred timbers and burned flesh. The streets once humming with the chatter of markets and the call of muezzins lie in silence, so complete it almost feels staged, an emptiness carefully curated by the conqueror. The Mongols did not merely take the city, they extinguished it. What remains are shattered walls, toppled domes, and the smell of blood seeping into sun-baked stone. The silence is not mercy, it is completion. This was Genghis Khan's lesson. His conquests were not reckless storms of violence as later chronicles sometimes suggest, but choreographed acts of demonstration. Samarkand was not destroyed simply to punish resistance. It was transformed into a theatre of fear, where survival itself became a message for other cities to read. Every smoking ruin was a word in his grammar of domination. Every sentence a punctuation mark more devastating than the roar of armies. Yet here is where the story turns darker still. Killing was only the beginning. The Mongols knew that corpses rot, walls can be rebuilt, and armies reformed. But humiliation seeded in the body and memory can endure for generations. The chroniclers record the slaughter, the looting, the fall of Samarkand's proud citadel, but what they hesitate to write is what followed, a policy not of destruction, but of replacement. The great Khan understood something most rulers never dared articulate, that conquest is most secure, not when enemies are dead, but when they are remade. So when you stand in the ashes of Samarkand, you are not merely standing in a cemetery, you are standing in a laboratory of empire. The survivors, women, children, the few spared, were not left free to mourn. They were absorbed, dismantled from the inside out. Their bodies became instruments of conquest. Their lineage, once Persian, once Khwarezmian, once local, was rewritten strand by strand. This was not random cruelty, it was policy, deliberate and codified. Imagine the terror of neighbouring cities as the report spread. It was not just the fear of losing lives or wealth, it was the horror of losing identity, of being erased at the root. The people of Samarkand had not merely fallen, they had been transformed into raw material for an empire that thrived on assimilation through domination. And in this lies the hook of our story. Genghis Khan was not only a conqueror of lands but of lineages, not just a breaker of cities but an architect of bloodlines. Samarkand's silence tells us something profound, that true conquest is not measured in corpses, but in the absence of memory, when the children of the defeated no longer remember the names of their fathers. It is here in this ruined city that we glimpse the terrifying scope of the Mongol vision. Their empire was not built solely on horses and arrows. It was built on the systematic colonization of the most intimate human bonds. This is the lesson of Samarkand, and it is where our story begins. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from 16 million? That is the number geneticists whisper when they speak of Genghis Khan's true empire. 16 million men alive today, spread across Central Asia from the steppes of Mongolia to the valleys of Afghanistan, from the Caspian shores to northern China, carry a genetic marker that can be traced back to a single male line. One man 8 centuries ago imprinted himself onto humanity's code in a way no king, no emperor, no prophet had ever achieved. That man was Temujin. The world remembers him as Genghis Khan. This number is not the product of folklore or exaggerated chronicles. It emerges from cold genetic science. In 2003, a team of population geneticists studying Y chromosome variation across Asia noticed something extraordinary. A cluster of nearly identical markers appeared in a vast swath of men, all pointing back to a single origin around the 13th century. The signature was too widespread, too sudden to be explained by chance. It was the footprint of an empire that had conquered not only cities but wombs. For comparison, think of how long it usually takes a lineage to spread. Centuries, even millennia. Family trees branch out slowly, filtered by geography, mortality, and the randomness of inheritance. Yet here was a lineage that exploded across half a continent in less than 100 years. This was not ordinary biology. It was deliberate. It was conquest expressed through genetics. And so we arrive at the haunting question: how does one man engineer such a legacy? Military power alone cannot explain it. Many conquerors left piles of corpses behind them, but their genetic signatures faded into obscurity. Genghis Khan's bloodline endures in millions. What he designed was something different, systematic, intentional, bureaucratized. A conquest that did not end with battlefield victories, but continued in bedrooms, nurseries, and the memories of children who would grow up never knowing another father than the empire itself. When we speak of Genghis Khan's empire, we usually picture maps shaded in broad swathes of colour, arrows moving across Asia, battles fought, cities razed. But beneath those lines of movement lies another empire, an invisible one. A kingdom of bloodlines coded into DNA surviving, even when monuments crumble and cities turn to dust. That is the empire that matters most. Because maps can be redrawn, but children carry their fathers within them. The men who surrendered without a fight to Genghis Khan's armies were not merely choosing survival. They were yielding their futures, and those who resisted and lost discovered a more brutal truth that defeat under Genghis was not the end of their lives but the end of their heritage. This is why the 60 million today matter. They are not a statistical curiosity. They are living monuments to a strategy that reached far beyond death into the marrow of humanity itself. The question lingers unsettling: what kind of mind conceives of conquest not just in terms of armies and tribute, but in the rewriting of human inheritance? To answer, we must step back into the world that forged Temujin. A boy on the steppes watching his family torn apart, learning that humiliation once inflicted can echo louder than any victory trumpet. The boy who would one day be remembered as Genghis Khan was not born into grandeur. He was born into wind and hunger. His name was Temujin, given to him around 1162 in a world so harsh that survival itself was a miracle. The Mongolian steppe was not a land of permanence but of motion-grass seas that shifted with the seasons, where clans lived in felt tents and followed the migrations of their herds. To live here meant to ride before you could walk, to wield a bow before you could read, and to understand that weakness was an invitation to be erased. Temujin was born clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, a sign the shamans whispered marked him for destiny. Yet destiny on the steppe was never guaranteed. His clan, the Borjigin, was Yuwafl in name, but no family could escape the web of betrayal and shifting alliances that defined nomadic politics. Every man was measured by his ability to defend his kin, every woman by the loyalty she commanded through bonds of marriage. To lose either was to invite annihilation. The Mongolian world was an arena of relentless competition. Neighbouring tribes raided one another not just for horses or cattle, but for honour. A successful raid proved superiority. A failed defence branded a clan with shame. Humiliation was not abstract, it was survival's opposite. If your enemies humiliated you, they weakened the trust within your family, shattered your reputation and made you vulnerable to further attack. Honour was currency, and Temujin's earliest education was learning its brutal arithmetic. As a child, he absorbed the landscape's lessons with sharp eyes. He watched how disputes were settled not by words but by arrows. He listened as elders recounted tales of betrayals, kidnappings and feuds stretching back generations. He saw how swiftly a powerful household could fall into despair if its leader lost his grip. In the steppe world there was no neutral ground. You dominated or you were dominated. Even within family, survival demanded toughness. Temujin's own mother, Hualun, had been abducted from another clan, forced into marriage with his father. For the young boy, even family bonds carried the shadow of violence. Love and loyalty existed, but they were always tethered to the possibility of loss. He grew up knowing that intimacy could be broken, that family itself could be stolen. This was not an accident of fate, it was the culture of the steppe where the abduction of women was as common as the theft of livestock. All of this carved into Temujin's mind a worldview that would later shape the empire he built. To him, domination was not a choice but the only way to endure. Every humiliation suffered was a reminder that survival meant not merely striking back, but striking so thoroughly that your enemies could never rise again. To ensure his family's safety, to keep his lineage intact, he would need more than arrows and horses. He would need to control the very bonds of loyalty and blood that others had used to wound him. The boy Temujin was not yet a conqueror, not yet the terror of Asia. But in the winds of the steppe, in the endless cycle of raid and reprisal, the seed of something relentless had already been planted. Temujin's first true lesson in power did not come from a battlefield. It came from the sight of his family being broken. He was still only a boy when his father Yesugai was poisoned by rivals after attending a feast. On the steppe, hospitality was supposed to bind clans together. Yet betrayal at the table was as common as the exchange of salt. One cup of poisoned kumis and Temujin's father was gone. With his death, the fragile protection of their household dissolved overnight. In the world of the steppe, a man's strength was the only shield that kept his family safe. Once that shield was shattered, vengeance arrived swiftly. Enemies closed in not with pity but with calculation, knowing that a widow and her children were prey. Her heirloom Temujin's mother had already lived the brutality of this culture. She herself had once been stolen in an abduction raid, ripped from her first husband's camp and forced into marriage with Yasugai. Such raids were not aberrations but traditions, proof of dominance as much as acts of desire. To take another man's wife was to dishonour him, permanently branding his lineage with weakness. Now the same weapon that had once delivered Heirloom to the Borjigin clan was turned against her again. With Yasugai dead, rival tribes raided their camp. Chroniclers hint at what happened next, though they often veil it in euphemism, the family's possessions stolen there, status stripped, and Heirloom herself violated as a symbol of her clan's humiliation. For a boy like Temujin, barely old enough to understand the codes of manhood, but old enough to remember every detail, it was an initiation into a truth more devastating than death, that enemies did not merely kill, they unmade. What Temujin witnessed was not only violence but strategy. He saw that his enemies did not stop with the removal of his father. They wanted to annihilate the family's future by degrading its matriarch. On the steppe, a man's honour was inseparable from the dignity of his wife and mother. To watch his mother publicly humiliated was to see his clan's spirit dismantled. That memory burned deeper than any scar of war. The Mongol world had no illusions about the role of women in conquest. They were both victims and vessels of political continuity. When abducted, they carried not only their bodies, but the legitimacy of one clan into another. Their children could be claimed as heirs, or as proof of domination. This way, women became battlegrounds themselves, fought over not with swords but with possession. Temujin's childhood revealed this to him in the cruelest way possible. For the boy who would become Genghis Khan, this was the crucible, his first understanding that warfare was not only about blood spilled on the ground, but about humiliation carved into memory. It was the realization that defeat was complete only when an enemy's women and children no longer remembered loyalty to their own blood. The lesson was not lost on him. He absorbed it silently, fiercely, and it would shape the empire. He would one day build an empire designed to ensure that no rival could ever inflict such degradation upon his family again. Humiliation, he learned as a child, was a sharper weapon than the arrow, and in that moment Temujin's destiny began to harden. While other boys on the steppe revelled in the chase of wild horses or the thrill of mock battles, Temujin's attention lingered in places where laughter fell silent in the smouldering ruins after a raid. He was a student of aftermath. Long before he learned to command warriors, he learned to observe the faces of those who had lost everything. The raids themselves were violent, yes, but they were brief flashes of chaos arrows in the night, the pounding of hooves, tents collapsing in flame. What lingered afterward was far more revealing. Temujin watched widows clutching the ashes of their hearths, children scavenging among the bones of livestock men, broken not by wounds but by the shame of failing to protect their families. He studied these survivors the way others studied herds, Austin. What weakened them, what silenced them, what made them submit rather than rise again. Across the steppe, humiliation was not incidental. It was a weaponized practice. Raids were not only about seizing cattle or slaves, they were rituals of dominance. To strip a man of his horse was to take his status. To abduct his wife or daughter was to wound his spirit in ways no blade could match. The defeated lived on, but as shadows carrying the public memory of their disgrace. A tribe humiliated was a tribe half-dead, vulnerable to absorption or extinction. Anthropologists centuries later would describe this as the economy of honor, but Temujin needed no textbook. He saw it with his own eyes. He noticed how humiliated clan rarely recovered, how shame was passed down like an heirloom, how mothers whispered to their sons that their fathers had failed. That memory eroded loyalty from within more effectively than any external force. For Temujin, these were lessons sharper than steel. He began to understand that true victory lay not in the battlefield moment, but in the erasure that followed. It was not enough to kill men who had to unmake the story they told about themselves. If their children grew up remembering their fathers, resistance would return. If their women bore new children fathered by conquerors, then memory itself could be rewritten. This way of thinking set him apart from other tribal leaders. Most were content with plunder, with the intoxicating rush of revenge. Temujin was not. He observed patterns, sought permanence, and imagined conquest not as a single raid, but as a generational project. To dominate meant to control the story survivors carried in their blood, to ensure that when they looked to their children, they no longer saw their own reflection. The young Temujin, shaped by hunger and loss, was already beginning to forge a philosophy of war that would terrify the world. He understood that arrows and swords ended lives, but humiliation ended lineages. And for him, survival was not about avoiding death. It was about ensuring that his people would never again bear the unbearable memory of being broken. At 16, Temujin was no longer the hungry boy clutching at scraps in the ashes of his family's ruin. He'd gathered a small band of followers, young men, as desperate as he was, bound by loyalty and the raw charisma that already clung to him. And with them, he launched his first independent raid. It was not grand by the standards of the steppe. No great Khan rode at his side. The plunder was meagre. Yet what mattered was not what he took, but what he declared. When the dust of the raid settled and the cries of the defeated quieted, Temujin gave an instruction that chilled even his own companions. He told them, "Do not simply kill their men. You must make their women forget they ever belonged to another tribe." These were not the words of a boy eager for loot. They were the words of someone who had studied humiliation and turned it into doctrine. On the steppe, women had long been the trophies of conflict. Raids ended with the theft of herds, weapons, and women. To seize wives and daughters was not only to gain labour and potential heirs, but to shame rival men, branding them as too weak to protect their households. Yet for most clans, this was opportunistic, episodic part of the cycle of raid and counter-raid. For Temujin, it was something more. He elevated what had been casual brutality into strategy, not a side effect of conquest, but its very heart. He saw women not merely as spoils, but as the vessels through which enemies could be rewritten. Their children would not remember the fathers who died, but the conquerors who claimed their mothers. In this way, the tribe itself would be reborn under his shadow. This was more than cruelty, it was policy. The difference is subtle but devastating. To others, abducted women were possessions. To Temujin, they were instruments of permanence. Loot could be lost, herds could scatter, but children born of conquered women would endure, carrying his blood, his clan's story, and no trace of their defeated fathers. By reinterpreting what the steppe had always done, he transformed rape into a systematic weapon, a tool for population engineering. His followers may not have understood the full implications that day, but Temujin had revealed the principle that would define his empire: to destroy an enemy, you did not simply kill their warriors, you eradicated their memory generation by generation. His first raid was small, but it carried within it the seed of a strategy that would one day rewrite the genetic map of half the world. From that moment, Temujin's path was set. He would not be just another raider. He would be the architect of a conquest that reached into bloodlines. And though the world could not yet see it, the boy who had tasted humiliation was beginning to build an empire designed to ensure that no enemy lineage survived unaltered. In 1178, when Temujin was still little more than a young upstart trying to carve space in a fractured steppe, he entered into what at first glance seemed an ordinary marriage. He took as his wife Berta, a woman from the Ongirat tribe whose family controlled fertile grazing lands and commanded valuable alliances. On the surface, this was a practical union. Marriages among Mongol tribes were never merely private affairs, they were transactions of survival, binding families together through bride wealth, livestock and oaths. But beneath the ritual exchange of gifts and the feasting of clans, something different stirred in Temujin's approach. Mongol marriage customs were intricate and deeply tied to power. A bride came with kalin, the bride wealth, horses, cattle, sometimes weapons, all offered to seal trust between families. The bride herself was not considered passive. Her loyalty could knit two clans together, ensuring that bloodshed gave way to alliance. Yet marriage also carried risks. If the alliance fractured, a woman could be seized back, abducted, or used as a pawn in the relentless cycle of tribal vendettas. Temujin's union with Berta was remembered by chroniclers not for its ceremony, but for its contract. According to accounts preserved in later retellings, the marriage agreement contained unusual provisions concerning the treatment of women captured in raids. Most tribes saw them as slaves or concubines' possessions without lineage. Temujin's vision was colder, more calculating. For him, such women were not trophies. They were instruments in a larger design, a way to erase the memory of defeated clans by bearing children who would belong only to their conquerors. Here was the chilling shift. In a culture where marriage usually strengthened kinship, Temujin's marriage codified conquest into the most intimate of spaces. Berta herself was elevated as chief wife, but her status also underscored the hierarchy he imagined for all women within his grasp, those who were free by alliance, and those who had become bound by defeat. Berta would become one of the most important figures in his life, not only as his first wife, but as the anchor of his legitimacy. Yet even in this personal choice, Temujin revealed the seeds of empire. Marriage for him was not only about producing heirs or binding families, It was a demonstration that the most enduring victories were won not just by the sword but by the womb. When he took Berta, Temujin was not yet the Khan of Khans, but already he had glimpsed a truth that others overlooked. Every alliance, every family bond, every captured woman could be turned into policy. Conquest was not only a matter of raiding camps or seizing herds, it was about reshaping the very structure of kinship itself, ensuring that the children of tomorrow no longer remembered the fathers of yesterday. In this way, his marriage was not just a union, it was a blueprint, a foreshadowing of the system that would one day make his empire not only vast in land, but in bloodlines that carried his legacy across continents. It did not take long for the fragility of Temujin's marriage to Berta to be tested. Only months after their union under the cover of darkness, a rival clan descended upon his camp, the Merkits, one of the most feared tribes of the northern steppe. They struck not for cattle, not for land, but for vengeance. Years earlier, Temujin's own father Yesugei had abducted Hurlun Temujin's mother from a Merkit household. The insult had never been forgotten. In steppe society, such wrongs were not washed away by time. They were debts carried across generations waiting for a moment to be repaid. Now the Merkits came to settle that score. They captured Berta, Temujin's new bride, and carried her away into captivity. To the Merkits, this was more than theft, it was poetic justice. As Yesugei had once taken their woman, they now took his sons. It was the cruel symmetry of steppe law where blood feuds turned lives into currency. For Temujin, the loss was devastating. Berta was more than his wife. She was the foundation of his fragile alliance with the Ongerat, and with her abduction he risked not only humiliation, but political collapse. In Mongol culture, the abduction of a wife was not merely a personal affront, it was a public stripping of honour. Every rival would see him as weak, incapable of defending his household. And weakness invited annihilation. Temujin's response was ruthless. He sought allies, the powerful Toktoa of the Karaite and Jamukha, his former blood brother. With their warriors, he launched a campaign against the Merkits. The battle that followed was not a skirmish but a punishment. The Merkits were crushed, their men slaughtered, their women taken. Berta was recovered, but she was not the same she had lived as another man's captive, and when she returned she carried a child whose paternity was uncertain. Historians debate whether her son Yohi was Temujin's or a Merkit's, but what mattered to Temujin was not biology, it was symbolism. This ordeal seared into his mind the most important lesson of his youth. Retaliation was not enough. Simply killing enemies avenged a wrong, but it did not prevent its recurrence. The Merkits had taken Berta to avenge a past humiliation. To ensure no one could ever wound him so again, Temujin realized he must do more than repay violence with violence. He must erase the possibility of future vengeance entirely. From that moment forward, he pursued not only the defeat of his enemies but the replacement of their bloodlines. To take their women and fold them into his own people was not incidental. It became the strategy itself, where most leaders saw raids as opportunities for plunder. Temujin saw a chance to rewrite the genealogy of the steppe, to transform enemies into unwilling vessels of his legacy. The Merkit incident crystallized this philosophy. It showed him that conquest was incomplete unless it reached into the heart of kinship. By ensuring that his enemies' descendants were his own, he could extinguish the very memory of resistance. Berta's abduction had been meant to humiliate him. Instead, it sharpened him into the kind of man who would never again allow humiliation to stand unanswered. For Temujin, it was the moment he ceased to be merely a survivor of raids and began to shape himself as the architect of empire. Blood could be spilled and lands abandoned, but bloodlines, those had to be controlled, absorbed, replaced. Only then he understood would vengeance lose its teeth. By the turn of the century, the boy who had once wandered the steppe with nothing but his mother's will to keep him alive had become something far greater. Around 1200, Temujin was no longer merely a survivor of raids or a claimant to scattered alliances. He was emerging as a ruler with a vision, and that vision was beginning to terrify the world. It was in this period that his generals first began to whisper about what they called the Complete Conquest Protocol. To outsiders, it may have looked like nothing more than an extension of raiding culture, swift cavalry strikes, the burning of cities, the elimination of rivals. But to those within Temujin's inner circle, it was something else entirely, a blueprint for erasing enemies not just militarily, but biologically. The Mongol way of war had always been built on mobility. Their armies moved like storms, able to cover distances in days that would take settled forces weeks. They relied on the composite bow, a weapon that could cut down an armoured knight at 100 paces. And they embraced meritocracy, elevating men by loyalty and skill rather than noble birth, ensuring that every warrior fought for opportunity as much as plunder. Terror too was a weapon. Entire villages were left standing only to spread news of the devastation they had witnessed, turning rumour into a force that conquered faster than any army. But Temujin was adding a new layer to this already fearsome arsenal reproduction as strategy. The protocol was simple even if its implications were monstrous. Defeat an enemy, kill the resisting men, absorb their women into the Mongol system, raise the children as Mongols with no memory of their father's name, no loyalty to their former tribe. Within 2 generations, resistance would vanish not because it was crushed, but because it no longer existed. To modern ears, it sounds almost too methodical, too cold, but this was the genius and horror of Temujin's approach. Where other leaders saw victory as the end of a campaign, he saw it as only the beginning. The aftermath mattered more than the clash itself. His goal was not simply to win battles, but to rewrite futures. Accounts from the secret history of the Mongols suggest that Temujin gave explicit instructions on how conquered populations were to be handled. Women were to be distributed among the victors not as casual prizes, but as instruments of consolidation. Children born of these unions were to be acknowledged as Mongols integrated into the empire's fold. This was not rape as byproduct, but as system, not chaos, but order. His generals soon understood the genius of it. An enemy might recover from military defeat in a decade, rebuild their walls, forge new alliances. But how could they rise again if their children no longer bore their blood, their names, their memories? The complete conquest protocol was not designed to destroy, it was designed to replace. By 1200, Temujin's army was no longer just a machine of war. It was a machine of transformation capable of turning the conquered into the conqueror's descendants. This was the true revolution of the Mongols' mobility on the battlefield terror, in the imagination and biological colonization in the home. Together, these made resistance not only futile but impossible to sustain. Temujin was on the cusp of declaring himself Khan of Khans, but already the shape of his empire was clear. It would not only be the largest in land, it would be the deepest in lineage. The empire was not just being written on maps, it was being written into blood. When Temujin rose as Genghis Khan in 1206, uniting the steppe under his banner, he understood that an empire could not survive on charisma alone. Charisma dies with the man who carries it. To endure conquest had to be inscribed into law, and so he created what came to be known as the Yasa, a code of rules, decrees and customs that became the spine of Mongol governance. The Yasa was not a book to be carried in saddlebags. It was oral, fluid and living. Some say scribes etched its provisions on scrolls kept in guarded chests, while others insisted existed only in memory recited by trusted keepers at great gatherings. What mattered was not whether it was written down, but that it was obeyed. Its enforcement was swift, often brutal, and its authority flowed directly from the Khan himself. To break the Yasa was not merely to commit a crime, it was to defy the structure of the empire. It is within this code that one finds the most chilling institutionalization of Temujin's philosophy of conquest. Among the articles nestled alongside rules on military discipline, hunting practices, and the conduct of envoys, was one that transformed the fate of conquered women into state policy. Chroniclers recorded in stark words, "The women of defeated enemies belong to the state until they have borne Mongol children." This was not casual brutality dressed in legal language. It was policy elevated to the level of law binding conqueror and conquered alike. Women were no longer just prizes seized in the chaos of war, they were resources managed by the state instruments of permanence. Through this article, reproductive control became not a matter of individual lust, but of imperial strategy. The implications are staggering. Where other empires taxed the land or conscripted labour, the Mongols taxed the womb. By codifying the absorption of women into the state's machinery, Genghis Khan ensured that population replacement was not a side effect but a deliberate outcome. This was conquest reframed as policy sanctified by law and mythologized as part of the divine mandate of the Khan. It is worth remembering that the Mongols saw law itself as an extension of the sacred. The Yasa was more than regulation, it was almost scripture. To violate it was to betray the destiny of the empire, to tear at the fabric of order that Genghis claimed heaven itself had granted him. Thus, Article 47 did not merely authorize domination, it sanctified it. It turned one man's trauma-born strategy into the architecture of empire. Historians would later debate how much of the Yasa was literal, and how much was reconstructed by chroniclers after the fact. But its spirit is undeniable. Conquest was to be complete, permanent and generational. Where walls fell in weeks and corpses rotted in months, the law ensured that the bloodlines of the conquered were bound to Mongol destiny forever. With the Yasa, Genghis Khan revealed a vision that no empire before had dared to codify, that the control of bodies, of intimacy, of reproduction itself was as essential to conquest as the bow or the horse. He had taken the lessons of humiliation from his childhood and carved them into law, ensuring that no successor could claim ignorance of the protocol he had forged. The empire was now written not only in blood but in statute. Among the most disturbing innovations of Genghis Khan's empire was the creation of units that did not fight battles in the traditional sense. They were not archers riding in tight circles nor siege engineers collapsing walls. They were something far more intimate and far more chilling. These were the detachments that Persian chroniclers writing with evident horror called the bloodline cavalry. Their purpose was not conquest through death but conquest through reproduction. Ibn al-Athir, the renowned Muslim historian, records his dismay at what he witnessed in the wake of Mongol campaigns. The Mongols, he wrote, have perfected what they call complete conquest. They do not simply defeat armies, they ensure no enemy bloodline survives to seek revenge by replacing it entirely with their own. His words are heavy, almost trembling, for he recognized something unprecedented. War had been transformed into a policy of generational erasure. The bloodline cavalry were not random marauders indulging in the chaos of plunder. They operated with the same discipline that Mongol generals demanded on the battlefield. Captives were categorized, women of reproductive age were distributed among specific units, and records were kept. What had been the unrestrained violence of raids across centuries was here reforged into bureaucracy. A soldier did not simply take, he fulfilled an assignment. This was the difference between atrocity and system. Atrocity is chaotic, a scar left by rage. System is deliberate, designed to repeat itself, to scale, to endure. Genghis Khan understood that if violence could be standardized, then so could reproduction. And in doing so, he ensured that conquest outlived the battlefield. For the chroniclers of Persia and Khwarezm, this was perhaps the most terrifying element of Mongol expansion. Armies could be fought, walls could be rebuilt, but how do you resist when your very blood is being replaced? When children born in your cities no longer speak your tongue or carry your name, but ride under the banners of the very horsemen who annihilated their fathers. The bureaucratization of atrocity is what made the Mongols different. They did not leave the aftermath to chance, they turned it into procedure. The bloodline cavalry were the embodiment of that procedure, soldiers who carried not only weapons, but an imperial mandate to alter the future itself. What Ibn al-Athir described in horror was nothing less than the mechanization of intimacy. It was war extended into the most private chambers, turned into policy by decree, and enforced with the same rigor as military discipline. And it was this system, more than any single battlefield victory, that explains why the empire of Genghis Khan endured and why his genetic legacy persists in millions of living men today. If the bloodline cavalry were the hands of Genghis Khan's reproductive strategy, then the quartermasters were its mind. These men, usually thought of as mere logisticians, keepers of horses, grain arrows, were given a new and horrifying responsibility. They recorded human beings with the same methodical precision they applied to livestock. Survivors of Mongol conquest describe registers kept not only of spoils and cattle, but of women divided into categories: noble-born, common, childbearing, elderly. The fate of each was decided not by whim but by system. Step 1. All men over a certain age, often 12 or 13, were eliminated. The logic was cruel but consistent. Remove the possibility of resistance at its root. Step 2. Women of reproductive age were grouped and allocated, some to the bloodline cavalry, others to Mongol commanders, still others to the Khan's own household. Step 3. Children born of these unions were not treated as half-outsiders. They were raised as Mongols, their former heritage erased. Within 2 generations, the conquered ceased to exist as a distinct people. To modernize, it reads less like war and more like animal husbandry. The Mongols, masters of the steppe, were already accustomed to breeding horses with meticulous care, recording lineages, selecting for speed, endurance, and strength. They applied the same mindset to humans. Just as herds could be improved through selective pairing, so too could conquered populations be reshaped to serve the empire. It is here that Genghis Khan's vision feels eerily modern. What he built anticipates what later philosophers and historians would call biopolitics, the control of entire populations through management of their bodies and reproduction. Centuries before the word existed, the Mongols were practicing it on a massive scale. We tend to think of empire as maps, borders, and taxation, but the Mongol system went deeper into the marrow of society itself. They engineered not just laws or armies, but people. Their policies ensured that the children of Bukhara Samarkand and Nishapur did not grow up Persian or Khwarezmiya, but Mongol, in blood, in training, in loyalty. It was conquest not only across space but across generations. What makes this especially chilling is its efficiency. Nothing was left to chance. Conquered women were not simply victims of individual soldiers' violence. They were redistributed as the part of a process overseen by state officials. Quartermasters, whose ledgers once tallied sheep and goats, now managed wombs, and in this system reproduction was no longer private. It was imperial business. When we reflect on later empires, on colonial systems that used sexual violence to degrade conquered peoples, on regimes that catalogued and classified subjects by race or bloodline, we see echoes of this Mongol innovation. They turned intimacy into governance, birth into policy. Genghis Khan understood what modern tyrants would rediscover: to truly control a people you must manage not only their lands and their labour, but their capacity to reproduce. In this, the Mongol Empire was not just the largest in landmass, it was the most intimate in its reach. It claimed not only cities and rivers, but futures, transforming the very blood of nations into its own possession. In 1219, a single insult ignited one of the most devastating campaigns the world had ever seen. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched from Persia to the steppes of Central Asia, a prosperous kingdom under Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. Its markets bustled with silks, spices and scholars. Its cities gleamed with mosques and libraries. But prosperity does not shield against arrogance. When the Shah seized and executed Mongol envoys, merchants and ambassadors sent under the sacred banner of diplomacy, he unknowingly signed the death warrant of his realm. For Genghis Khan, this was no ordinary offence. Among the nomads of the steppe, the envoy was sacred, his safety guaranteed by custom older than empires. To kill an ambassador was to spit in the face of heaven itself. The insult required not just retaliation, but obliteration, a punishment so severe that no ruler would dare repeat it. And so began what chroniclers would later describe as the complete lesson. This was conquest not only in arms, but in annihilation and replacement. Genghis Khan unleashed his armies westward, and with them his doctrine of erasure. The first jewel to fall was Bukhara. Persian historian Atamalik Juvaini, who would later chronicle the Mongol Wars, paints the scene with words heavy as stone. The Mongols stormed the walls, and when resistance was crushed, the Khan himself entered the city's great mosque. Standing before the faithful, he declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The words were not mere bluster, they were theatre designed to burn into memory. Bukhara's scholars and nobles were executed, its artisans and women distributed, its children destined to grow up with no memory of the city's proud heritage. From Bukhara, the armies rolled on to Samarkand. Here, the devastation was even more thorough. Contemporary accounts describe systematic slaughter, tens of thousands killed, though numbers blur into myth when horror becomes too great to count. What mattered was not the arithmetic of corpses, but the symbolism of survival. Those left alive were divided, categorized, reassigned. Women of noble houses were taken into the Khan's personal system of imperial education, ensuring that the humiliation of Samarkand's elite would endure in their own bloodlines. Children born thereafter would carry Mongol names, not Khwarezmian ones. Juvaini's account trembles with awe and despair. He describes the destruction not as chaos, but as a method, a grim choreography of vengeance. The Mongols killed selectively, sparing artisans and craftsmen to be sent eastward while obliterating the ruling families who could one day rekindle resistance. The strategy was precise: erase leadership, absorb labour, seed the next generation with Mongol blood. This was not only the sack of cities, it was population engineering on a scale the Islamic world had never seen. For the Shah there was no salvation. He fled westward, abandoning his people dying in isolation on a Caspian island. His empire crumbled behind him, its proud cities turned into silent laboratories of Mongol conquest. The complete lesson had been delivered. To insult the Khan was to invite not only the ruin of your dynasty, but the obliteration of your bloodline. What unfolded in Khwarezm was the most systematic demonstration of Genghis Khan's philosophy. Victory was not measured in walls toppled or treasures seized, but in genealogies broken and rewritten. The Mongols did not simply defeat the Khwarezmian Empire, they replaced it from the faces of its future children to the memory of its fallen cities. When the armies had done their work, walls shattered, Tehtas cut down resistance, silenced. Genghis Khan himself turned to what he called the real task, the reshaping of survivors. He did not leave this work to chance nor delegate it entirely to generals. He understood too well the symbolic weight of what came next. In the aftermath of conquest, he personally oversaw the assignment of women, especially those of noble birth, and in this chilling act we see the clarity of his purpose. For the Khan, noble women were not simply captives. They were the vessels of a lineage, the embodiment of dynastic pride, the living symbols of legitimacy. To subjugate them was not only to wound their families, but to dismantle the memory of authority itself. In the Mongol world, where alliances and succession often flowed through marriage, the control of highborn women was equivalent to the control of kingdoms. Their humiliation rippled outward, destabilizing entire social orders. Accounts from Persian chroniclers describe how women of elite households were set apart, brought directly before Genghis. He studied them not with the eyes of a lover, but with the calculation of a ruler. Assignments were deliberate daughters of rulers given to his generals to secure loyalty, widows of princes redistributed as trophies of obedience, concubines of wealthy merchants folded into the household of the Khan. This was not the randomness of plunder, it was imperial education. The phrase may sound benign, but it carried a devastating logic. By taking noble women from their defeated homes and placing them into Mongol households, Genghis ensured that the future children of these lines would grow up Mongol in name, language, and loyalty. A Khwarezmian princess raising the son of a Mongol officer was no longer a symbol of her people's endurance. She was a reminder of their subjugation, her body turned into a genealogy that no longer carried her father's name. In the culture of the steppe, and indeed across the Islamic and Persianate world, such women were more than daughters and wives. They were threads in the fabric of legitimacy. Dynasties claimed power through the women they married or captured, boasting of alliances sealed with noble blood. By seizing these women and redirecting their wombs, Genghis was not simply indulging in cruelty. He was dismantling legitimacy itself, transferring honor from the defeated to the victors. Imagine the psychological devastation in an elite household that once traced its lineage through centuries of scholarship wealth or divine sanction, now saw its daughters bearing children who would speak Mongol ride as Mongols and one day command Mongol troops. In the space of a single generation, centuries of pride could vanish. Genghis Khan's imperial education was not about literacy or learning in the scholarly sense. It was the education of subjugation, the training of noble women to embody the empire's dominance. Each assignment was both a humiliation and a warning. No bloodline, however proud, was beyond absorption. In this policy, we see the starkest evidence of how the Khan thought. Victory was not complete until the very symbols of power, royal daughters, noble wives, were repurposed as instruments of his own dynasty. By taking their bodies, he took their futures. And in doing so, he left a scar deeper than ruins or graves, the scar of legitimacy itself rewritten. The Mongols understood that conquest did not end with victory on the battlefield. It continued in the homes and hearths of the conquered, in the faces of children who grew up never knowing the language, gods, or stories of their forefathers. To ensure this, Genghis Khan turned his empire into a machine of identity-making. Genealogical tracking was at the heart of this system. Mongol record keepers, the same men who tallied herds and weapons, began keeping careful accounts of children born from conquered women. Chroniclers whisper of ledgers that resembled family trees, but family trees with severed roots. A Persian boy born to a mother taken from Samarkand would not be raised as Persian. He would be named in Mongol fashion, given to a Mongol household, and taught from infancy that his loyalty was to the Khan. His father's name, his grandfather's honor, the stories of his people, all were erased before he could even speak. To the defeated, this was a slower death than massacre, but in many ways more unbearable. Imagine a family watching their daughter cradle a child whose bloodline was half Mongol, a child who would grow up riding horses in a Mongol camp, speaking a Mongol tongue, swearing allegiance to the very men who had slaughtered his uncles. It was to see extinction written not in ash, but in flesh. Anthropologists describe this as cultural erasure through assimilation, but in the 13th century it felt like the theft of souls. The Mongols were not content to rule over subject peoples, they sought to transform them from within. Identity itself became conquest's battlefield. Where Rome had conquered through law and roads, where China conquered through bureaucracy and Confucian schooling, the Mongols conquered through the cradle. The process was deliberate. Children born of these unions were given privileges if they swore loyalty, trained as warriors or administrators. Their place in Mongol society secured by the very blood that had been used to erase their heritage. Resistance became impossible when the next generation no longer remembered why they should resist. The songs of fathers faded, replaced by the drilling of Mongol commands. For the conquered, this was the cruelest paradox. Their survival guaranteed their erasure. To surrender meant to live, but to live meant to watch one's children belong to another people entirely. The trauma was generational, a grief renewed every time a mother heard her child speak in a tongue not her own, every time she saw her child's future pledged to the empire that had destroyed her past. This is why Genghis Khan's empire outlasted not only his lifetime, but the memory of many of the nations it consumed. It was not just cities that were rebuilt under Mongol rule, it was identities, genealogies, and even blood itself. Conquest had become generational, a war fought not once but again and again in every nursery. For those left behind, the greatest horror was not their own suffering, but the faces of their children living proof that their lineage was already gone, their identity swallowed, their memory replaced by the empire of the Khan. Fear often marches faster than armies, and under Genghis Khan it became his most reliable advance guard. By the 1220s, Mongol conquests were preceded not just by the thunder of hooves, but by rumours, whispered tales carried by merchants, refugees, and trembling survivors who had fled with little more than their memories. These stories were more devastating than any catapult, for they promised not just death but humiliation that reached into the marrow of lineage. The message was simple, and it spread like fire. The Mongols do not only kill, they replace. Villagers heard of cities where every male above adolescence had been slaughtered, where women were parcelled out in groups, where children were raised as Mongols. In Bukhara, in Samarkand, in Nishapur, the pattern was too consistent to be dismissed as exaggeration. Populations began to understand that defeat meant not just losing walls or wealth, but watching your family's very bloodline vanish. And this realization broke resistance before arrows ever flew. Entire towns surrendered without a fight, throwing open their gates in the desperate hope that submission might spare them the complete lesson. Rulers who once boasted of their army's strength found their soldiers deserting, unwilling to fight, when the consequence of failure was not only death but dishonor. Their wives and daughters claimed by conquerors, their names obliterated from memory. Psychologists today might call this contagion of terror, the way stories of degradation spread like a virus, infecting the minds of those who had never seen the Mongols themselves. Fear dissolved trust, made neighbours suspect one another, hollowed out the will to resist. Why risk battle when survival meant surrender, and surrender at least preserved a flicker of life? This is perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Genghis Khan's conquest. His armies sometimes travelled slower than his reputation. By the time his horsemen appeared on the horizon, cities had already crumbled from within, undone by the horror they expected to follow. Resistance, the very heart of collective identity, was disarmed not on the battlefield, but in the imagination. The Mongols had discovered what few empires ever truly mastered, that humiliation spreads faster than arrows, and the anticipation of conquest can be more paralyzing than conquest itself. To resist meant not only to risk death, but to risk your children growing up as strangers, your blood erased from the story of the world. In this way, fear became empire's most faithful servant. It galloped ahead of the Mongol armies, dissolving resistance before the first clash of steel. And behind it came the Khan, not merely to destroy, but to collect what terror had already delivered into his hands. When we speak of Genghis Khan's empire, we usually point to maps shaded in vast swathes of colour, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian. But there is another empire, an invisible one that cannot be drawn with borders. It resides not in stone or parchment, but in flesh. Modern science has revealed that as many as 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome signature that points directly back to Genghis Khan and his immediate male lineage. The key lies in the Y chromosome itself. Unlike most genetic material, which shuffles and recombines with every generation, the Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son. It is a thread of inheritance that can stretch across centuries with remarkable fidelity. When geneticists began studying Central Asian populations in the early 2000s, they noticed something astonishing: an unusually widespread cluster of nearly identical Y chromosome markers distributed across vast territories once held by the Mongols. The statistical explosion could not be explained by chance. The simplest answer was also the most chilling: the male line of Genghis Khan had multiplied, at a scale unseen in human history. His sons and grandsons carried forward the same reproductive policy he had pioneered, ensuring that their blood replaced the very populations they subdued. This was not only the legacy of one man. Genghis fathered children with countless wives and concubines, but so too did his heirs. Jochi Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tlui, his 4 primary sons, spread the lineage through their own conquests and their descendants' marriages. Mongol princes in China, Persia, and Russia inherited not only lands but also the practice of securing dominance through reproduction. The effect was exponential. Consider what this means while many dynasties disappeared after a few generations consumed by rival claimants or erased by history's tides, the Mongol line did the opposite. It expanded outward, embedding itself into the genetic fabric of half a continent. Each conquest was not only political but biological. Each treaty marriage was not only diplomacy but dynasty-making. This genetic footprint is not a curiosity of science, it is a living monument. When a herder in Kazakhstan, a farmer in Uzbekistan, or a merchant in northern China today carries that Y chromosome, they are in an unbroken line heirs to the Mongol experiment in generational conquest. It is a legacy that forces us to reconsider what empire means. For most conquerors, victory is temporary, undone by time. For Genghis Khan, victory became hereditary. His empire was written into DNA, carried invisibly through the centuries by millions who have no memory of the man himself. And this perhaps was the truest measure of his conquest, not the walls he toppled, or the crowns he stole, but the fathers erased and the sons replaced. Genghis Khan's genetic empire is proof that conquest can live on not in monuments, but in the very blood of those who walk the earth today. The Mongols may have pioneered the systematic fusion of conquest and reproduction, but they were not the last to wield it. The template Genghis Khan forged, where domination of bodies secured, domination of nations echoed across centuries, reappearing in empires and wars long after his horsemen had vanished from the steppe. In the Ottoman Empire, for instance, a different but related system emerged, the devshirme. Beginning in the 14th century, Christian boys from the Balkans were seized, converted and raised as janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops. Though not sexual conquest in the Mongol sense, it was kinship conquest, all the same sons stripped from their families and reborn as loyal soldiers of the empire. Their bloodlines redirected to serve a new master. It was a subtler form of what Genghis had already demonstrated, that the surest way to erase resistance is to reprogram the next generation. Centuries later in the Americas, European colonization carried the same shadow. Rape was not random but systemic, used to degrade indigenous women and ensure that their children grew up tethered by law, by culture or by blood to the colonizer's identity. In Latin America, whole populations became what chroniclers called mestizo, evidence of conquest not just in territory, but in the wombs of women who had no choice. It was Genghis Khan's legacy in another register, carried out not by horse archers, but by muskets and priests. Even in the 20th century, echoes of this ancient template resurface in ways we are reluctant to confront. During conflicts in Bosnia, Rwanda and Darfur, systematic sexual violence was deployed not as incidental brutality, but as a weapon of policy. Women were targeted precisely because their ability to bear children could be turned against their people. The logic was identical to that of the 13th century Mongols. Erase, fathers rewrite future's seed terror, not just in the moment but in generations to come. Historians and human rights scholars now use terms like ethnic cleansing and genocidal rape to describe what Genghis Khan would have recognized immediately as an instrument of empire. The strategy is consistent: kill the men who can resist, seize the women who can bear, and raise children who carry the conqueror's lineage instead of the vanquished. This continuity across ages is what makes the Mongol system so haunting. It was not an aberration of medieval savagery, but an early articulation of a logic that human cruelty would rediscover again and again. The details shift devshirme boys in Ottoman palaces, mestizo children in colonial missions, scarred survivors in modern refugee camps, but the principle remains: control reproduction, and you control the future. Genghis Khan's empire revealed the brutal truth that domination of the womb can be more lasting than domination of the sword, and the empires that followed, whether consciously or not, traced his footsteps. His complete conquest was not only a Mongol doctrine, it became a grim inheritance of human history, a reminder that where power seeks permanence, it often seeks it in the most intimate of places. Michel Foucault, writing in the 20th century, described the rise of what he called biopower, the ability of states to control populations not merely through laws or armies, but by managing bodies, reproduction, and the intimate rhythms of life itself. Modern governments, he argued, exercise power not only by punishing crimes or levying taxes, but by deciding who may live, who may die, and how new generations will be born. It is a framework we usually associate with censuses, hospitals, prisons, and the quiet machinery of modern bureaucracies, Yet in the 13th century, Genghis Khan had already grasped this truth with terrifying clarity. The Khan's genius and his horror was to understand that conquest was incomplete until it reached into the biology of his enemies. He did not stop at borders or thrones. He penetrated the deepest layer of human existence, family kinship reproduction. Where most rulers measured their power in soldiers or silver, he measured it in wombs, in children, in bloodlines that bore no memory of their fathers. This was biopolitics before the word existed. Consider the way he transformed private life into state business. Marriage, which elsewhere might be an affair of love or alliance, became in Mongol hands an instrument of control. Women were not merely taken, they were reassigned, redistributed, managed like resources. Quartermasters tracked them just as modern states track birth rates. Children born of conquest were registered, absorbed, and raised to serve the empire. What we today call demographic policy, who is encouraged to reproduce, who is prevented, who is erased, was already present in the Yasa, the bloodline cavalry, and the systematic redistribution of conquered populations. Foucault argued that biopower emerges when the state declares itself guardian of life but also arbiter of death. Genghis Khan embodied this duality with precision. His armies exterminated entire classes of men, potential rivals, resistors, future rebels, while carefully preserving and repurposing women and artisans. He chose which bloodlines would be extinguished and which would be absorbed. In this way, his empire was not only the largest in geography, but also the most intimate in reach, governing lives before they were even conceived. What is chilling is how familiar this logic feels when we look at later centuries. Population censuses and colonial empires, eugenics, policies in the 20th century, modern regimes that manipulate reproductive rights, all echo the principle that power is most enduring when it governs the future of bodies, not merely the present of armies. Genghis anticipated this without philosophy, without theory. For him it was instinct born of trauma sharpened into law. And so when we call him not only a conqueror but a visionary of domination, we must recognize the breadth of his foresight. His empire teaches us that the battlefield is never just terrain. It is the body, the womb, the child. And in his chilling clarity, Genghis Khan revealed what Foucault would one day put into words, that the deepest power a ruler can wield is the power to shape life itself, to dictate not just how people live, but who will exist at all. Behind the statistics, behind the chronicles of conquest and the calculations of geneticists, there are lives, millions of them, swallowed in silence. If Genghis Khan's empire was written in bloodlines, then it was also written in erasures of women whose names were never recorded, of children who grew up never knowing the language of their fathers, of cultures absorbed until their songs faded into echoes. The chroniclers, Persian, Chinese, Arab, wrote about the battles, the strategies, the decrees, but they rarely wrote about the women themselves. We do not know their words, only their roles, wives, concubines taken. Their voices were carried in the wind of oral tradition, in fragments of grief that sometimes surface centuries later. Folklorists have traced laments sung by women in Central Asia, songs of mourning, for homes lost for brothers, buried for children who would never again speak their mother's tongue. In these verses, the statistics dissolve and the human cost emerges. Sorrow, humiliation, memory stripped away. Imagine a noble woman from Samarkand brought before the Khan and assigned to a general. Her father slain, her brothers executed, her household dissolved. She is not killed. Instead, she lives on, carrying within her the seed of the empire that has destroyed her. Each child she bears is both survival and betrayal, a living reminder that her bloodline no longer belongs to itself. What is her grief when she rocks her infant to sleep, whispering lullabies in a language the child will never pass on? Or consider the common women divided into groups of hundreds, parcelled out to cavalry units. They became statistics in Mongol ledgers, their wombs tracked like herds. Their suffering rarely reached parchment, yet their silence tells us everything. They endured not because they chose to, but because the alternative was death. Survival meant complicity forced upon them, a complicity that erased their families' futures. And then the children. They are the cruel paradox of this conquest. Born of violence, yet innocent. Raised as Mongols, they became riders, artisans, administrators of the empire that had erased their fathers. They never knew the stories their grandmothers once told, and never spoke the proverbs of their people, never prayed to the gods of their ancestors. In their eyes, the past was gone before it could even be remembered. Languages, too, were casualties. Dialects once spoken in the markets of Khwarezm, songs once sung in the vineyards of Bukhara, stories once told by Persian grandmothers at night, all slowly vanished as Mongol became the language of loyalty. Each lost word was a life erased in miniature. It is easy to marvel at the scale of conquest, to shudder at the genius of its system. But to truly understand it, we must pause here in the silence left behind. Behind every genetic marker is a woman who cried into the night. Behind every erased lineage is a culture that grieved its extinction. Behind every Mongol child born of conquest is a people who disappeared from history's record. The cost in human terms cannot be calculated, only felt in the silences of chronicles, in the laments of forgotten songs, in the subterfuge that entire nations, once alive in memory, now live only in the shadows of empire. Return then to the ruins of Samarkand. The smoke has long since drifted away, the walls rebuilt and toppled again across centuries, yet the silence of that spring in 1220 still lingers. It was there that Genghis Khan taught his most terrifying lesson. Conquest is never only a matter of swords and arrows. It reaches deeper into the womb, into memory, into the very possibility of who we become. Standing among those stones, you begin to see empire not as lines drawn on maps, but as shadows cast over generations. Genghis Khan showed that the battlefield does not end at the city gates. It follows into homes, into families, into the bodies of women and the faces of children. He understood that to annihilate an enemy fully, you must not only kill their men, but reprogram their future. It was a conquest written in bloodlines, enforced through humiliation, and made permanent by the quiet obedience of children who would never know their fathers' names. This is why Samarkand's silence matters. It is the echo of lives not just ended, but rewritten. It is the reminder that institutions can weaponize intimacy, that power can invade even the spaces we imagine private and sacred. In this sense, Genghis Khan anticipated a truth history would reveal again and again, that control over intimacy is control over identity, and control over identity is control over destiny. The ruins warn us to be vigilant. When power seeks permanence, it does not stop at wealth or territory, it reaches into the fabric of life itself. When institutions decide whose children matter, whose names survive, whose blood continues, the cost is not only counted in lives lost, but in worlds erased. And yet even amid the devastation, the lesson is not only despair, it is also a call to guard dignity fiercely, to defend the bonds of family memory and culture against forces that would strip them bare. History does not repeat mechanically, but its patterns whisper. The story of Samarkand reminds us to listen. For in the end, what survives of empire is not only conquest, but the human will to resist erasure. Dignity carried quietly from generation to generation is the only counterweight to the silence Genghis left behind, and it is our task as heirs to history to protect it. The Empire. Written in silence. Lessons from Genghis Khan's conquest. History often dazzles us with its maps of empires, its chronicles of battles, and its portraits of kings. But the story of Genghis Khan's conquest reminds us that the most enduring forms of power are not always drawn in blood on the battlefield. They are etched quietly and devastatingly into the intimate fabric of human life. When the Mongols rode into Samarkand in 1220, they did not simply topple walls and slaughter soldiers. They rewrote futures. By controlling reproduction, killing men, redistributing women, raising children as Mongols, Genghis Khan ensured that resistance would not return in the next generation. His empire was not only territorial, it was biological and psychological. Modern genetics confirms this chilling foresight. Millions alive today carry his Y chromosome, evidence of conquest that never ended at the city gates, but continued in homes and nurseries. What lessons does such darkness offer us living centuries later? The first is a warning about how power works. Institutions, whether empires, governments, or corporations, often seek permanence not just through laws or armies, but by shaping the most intimate aspects of life. Michel Foucault would later call this biopower control over bodies, reproduction, and identity. Genghis Khan understood this instinctively. His example reminds us to remain vigilant. When power begins to dictate the terms of intimacy, who belongs, who can reproduce, whose stories are remembered, it does more than control the present. It tries to colonize the future. The second lesson is about the fragility of identity. For the people of Samarkand or Bukhara, defeat meant more than ruined streets. It meant watching their children grow up with different names, different loyalties, different languages. Cultures can be erased not only by fire, but by forgetting. In our world where cultures mingle, migrate, and sometimes vanish under the weight of larger forces, we are reminded of the importance of memory. Songs, stories, and traditions are not luxuries, they are defences against erasure. To preserve them is to resist silence. The third lesson is dignity. The Mongols showed that humiliation spreads faster than armies breaking resistance before battles are fought. But history also shows that dignity fiercely guarded can endure longer than conquest. Even when bloodlines were replaced, laments were sung, whispered prayers carried fragments of memory endured. Dignity cannot always prevent defeat, but it can prevent extinction of the spirit. And finally, there is the lesson of responsibility. We are not only heirs of our own families, we are heirs of histories like this. To know that institutions can weaponize intimacy should sharpen our resolve to protect what is most human, the sanctity of family, the privacy of love, the right to define one's own identity. Samarkand's ruins are a reminder. Power will always attempt to stretch beyond borders, into the body, beyond armies, into memory. Our task in every age is to defend the spaces where dignity lives, to ensure that silence does not swallow memory, to guard fiercely the fragile inheritance of being human. That is the lesson that endures. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.